Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Super excited to see you again after a little bit of a summer recess. We're trying something new this week. We're going to have a wonderful hour-long conversation with Salwa and Gerard from Military Court Watch, but then we're going to keep the meeting open for an extra half hour on the back end. No pressure to stay if you need to go back to work or hop off for something else, but we've been missing some of the connection time with all of you. We love having our guests come in, but we want to make sure we have enough time for us to connect as a community, talk about what's going on now, hear, wins or challenges in your own lives as it relates to doing some activism or advocacy around this in your own communities. So unlike previous meetings, don't hop off when the hour ends. Please stay and chat. But before that, we've got a really great conversation with two guests that I'm super excited to invite back to Telos. They've been longtime friends and partners, Salwa Dubais and Gerard Horton. I'll get into their backgrounds, why we've invited them in a minute, but I wanted to say a couple words about why we wanted to talk about the issue of administrative detention. As Salwa and Gerard will explain to us, it's one that affects so many different facets of daily life for everyone in Palestinian society. The implications are far-reaching beyond the event itself. And I think sometimes, especially in the US or in Canada, we expect other legal systems to work like our own, or we assume, good intent for legal systems. So it's really good to stay curious about differences and to kind of let ourselves be, I'm going to say, surprised at some of the things we might assume are in place to protect people that really aren't. Part of also learning about this is that it offers us an opportunity to try and act to change unjust systems, policies, and practices with real-world impact. So I hope we won't just learn about the challenges of administrative detention today, but that we'll land somewhere where we understand ways we can advocate or be aware of or try and change some of the problems that we are going to learn about. So with that, I'm going to introduce Salwa and Gerard. They both wear a lot of hats, have rich and varied backgrounds, so we're focusing on their work with Military Court Watch today, which they co-founded. But before that, Gerard was a lawyer and formerly worked with Defense for Children International. Salwa is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. She's worked with the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, has a focus on human rights violations against Palestinian women, and both of them are really committed to protecting human rights and working within the legal system to try and hold it accountable to higher values. Together, they co-founded Military Court Watch, an organization that monitors the treatment of children in Israeli detention from their arrest all the way through to their release. They advocate, sometimes including through litigation, to ensure that all children that come in contact with the military legal system are treated with equality in accordance with the law. And part of that is their court monitoring program, which is how I met Salwa and Gerard back in 2019. I got to hear a talk from them much like this, and then I went with Salwa to the Offer Military Court to watch some of these unjust legal proceedings in process, and it left a huge impression on me. So Salwa and Gerard, welcome. We are so grateful to have you with us. Gerard's going to start giving us some legal background, context, dive into some of the details, and then Salwa will shed light on the impact that these issues have on society more broadly. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So please do think of questions you'd like to ask them specific to these issues. So without further ado, Gerard, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity to talk. I'll just mention that we'll be talking more broadly about the issue than just administrative detention, but we will obviously be touch upon administrative detention as well. What I thought I would do is give you basically a thumbnail sketch of the military detention system and how it fits into the bigger picture of control of the West Bank. Just very briefly, the organization, there are 12 of us, mainly lawyers from Palestine, Israel, Europe, North America, and Australia. And we just focus on the one issue, prosecution of Palestinian children in military courts. The foundation of our work basically is evidence gathering. So each year we collect at least 100 testimonies from Palestinian children who are arrested by the Israeli military in the West Bank. And that works out at about 10 to 20% of the total number who are arrested. So it's quite a good sample. So anywhere between about 500 and 1,000 children get detained each year. And when we say children, the military courts have jurisdiction over children as young as 12 years old, but the overwhelming majority of children who go through this system are 17, 16, and 15. And we'll mainly be talking about boys. Very few girls go through the system, usually less than 2%. And what we do with this evidence is we analyze it for particularly what happens in the first 48 hours following arrest, because that's when most issues of concern arise. So was the child arrested in a military raid on their home in the middle of the night? Were they blindfolded, zip-tied? Do they allege they were mistreated? Were their rights under Israeli military law respected, such as the right to silence and the right to consult with a lawyer? But there's always one particular feature of this evidence that stands out as being highly significant, and that is the location of arrest. Based on the evidence we've collected over more than 10 years, our evidence shows that at least 95% of the children who are arrested in the West Bank live within several kilometers of an Israeli settlement or a road used by settlers in the West Bank. And that's not a coincidence. And we'll go on to explain why we say that's not a coincidence. Before I do that, I'll just say a few words briefly about the military courts themselves. So they were set up on the 7th of June, 1967, 3 days into the Six-Day War. Israel placed the whole of the West Bank under martial law on the 7th of June, 1967, set up military courts and started prosecuting Palestinian civilians who violated that military law in those military courts. As of the 7th of June, 1967, Israel was perfectly entitled to do that. Following a war, when there's an occupation, the occupying power can place the territory under martial law. Obviously, there are a number of conditions. An obvious condition is it's supposed to be temporary. But as of the 7th of June, 1967, Israel was perfectly entitled to do what it did. Interestingly, I think the military order that set up the military courts, military order number 3 of the 7th of June, 1967, expressly referenced the Fourth Geneva Convention as the legal basis upon which Israel was acting. So Israel itself was relying on the Fourth Geneva Convention as of the 7th of June, 1967. What then happened in the weeks and the months following the 7th of June, 1967, is a political discussion took place inside Israel as to what to do with that territory. And those that wanted to keep it and settle it basically won the discussion. And the best evidence for that is by September 1967, the first Israeli settlers started to move into the West Bank. And then you did have a legal problem because, as I'm sure you are all aware, that same convention that allows for temporary military law also prohibits settlement construction in occupied territory. So that then placed the Israeli military lawyers in a difficult position. A few months earlier in June, they had drafted military order number 3, relying on the Fourth Geneva Convention to justify martial law and military courts. And now the politicians in Israel were allowing settlers to move into the West Bank in violation of that same convention. So as lawyers, they had to try and come up with some sort of solution. What they did was fairly simple. They passed an amendment to military order number 3, and they basically just deleted all the references to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Like I said, not very sophisticated. They carried on prosecuting Palestinians in military courts and settling the West Bank. And that's why we've had this legal issue for the last 56 years ever since then. Fast forward today, the latest data I've seen is there's something like 750,000 Israeli civilians now living in occupied territory. The breakdown is approximately 500,000 in the West Bank and about 250,000 in East Jerusalem. We will just talk about the 500,000 in the West Bank because that's where military law is still in place today. So the situation now is you have 500,000 Israeli civilians living in the West Bank in illegal settlements among about 3 million Palestinians. And once the politicians in Israel thought that was a good thing to do, they handed over the day-to-day responsibility of actually making it work in practical terms to the Israeli army. And I think if you stop and think about that for a moment, it's hard to imagine a more challenging mission any army in the world could be given than having to guarantee the protection of 500,000 civilians essentially wandering around a conflict zone. And yet that's the mission the Israeli army has been given for the last 56 years. How successful have they been in that mission? There are any number of ways you could try and calculate that, but let's just take a really basic calculation. How many settlers get killed in the West Bank each year as a result of the conflict? Based on the statistics on B'Tselem's website, the average fatality rate for settlers in the West Bank for the last 10 years is 7.4. It's gone up a little bit because there's been more violence this year. Now, not to trivialize those deaths when they occur, it's important to appreciate that more settlers get killed in road traffic accidents in the West Bank than they do in the conflict. It's an extraordinary military achievement. And the question that has raised in our minds at Military Court Watch is, what are some of the tactics being employed by the army in the West Bank to achieve such an extraordinary result? And it's these tactics I'll talk a little bit about now, because it's these tactics we see in our day-to-day work in the villages and refugee camps up and down the West Bank, and the military courts, and indeed administrative detention are relevant to these tactics. The best way, I think, to understand it is to break it down to a local level, village by village, settlement by settlement in the West Bank. So picture this, a small settlement in the West Bank, maybe just 500 settlers living there. It will be surrounded by a number of Palestinian communities and a road network used by everyone, connecting that settlement to different parts of the West Bank and back to Israel. In charge of that location will be an Israeli military commander, and it's his job to guarantee the protection of those 500 settlers living in occupied territory. And let's take a really typical kind of case we deal with, and that's stone throwing. So let's say that military commander gets a telephone call from the settlement he's responsible for, and someone tells them they've seen a group of Palestinians on the side of the road throwing stones at settler buses, settler cars on the road near the settlement. Obviously, if people are throwing stones at vehicles on a road, the potential for harm is significant. Whether harm is caused or not, the point for that commander is he's got an act of resistance. What will he do in response to that act of resistance? Now, he knows from his experience doing this job that if he sends a unit of soldiers to that location in the road where the incident was reported, almost certainly any stone throwers will be long gone when the soldiers get there. So they're probably not going to catch anyone. So it poses a real dilemma for the commander. He's got an active resistance. He knows it's Palestinians, but he can't positively identify anyone to arrest or prosecute in the military courts. So what's he to do? He's basically got a choice. He could either do nothing, say to himself, well, couldn't catch anyone today, who knows, maybe we'll have better luck catching someone tomorrow. If you take that approach in occupied territory, you probably won't remain in occupied territory for very long. It's not an option. But again, who's he going to punish for that act of resistance? Basically, what these commanders do is they make a couple of assumptions. They've got nothing to do with the law, but from a military perspective, they're pretty reasonable, I think. First assumption is the stone throwers were Palestinian males aged between about 10 and 30. That would generally be the case. Assumption number two is they came from the nearest Palestinian village, and that too is probably going to be the case. What he then does with those two assumptions is he will pass those along to the local Israeli intelligence officer. So just like the West Bank has been divided up into military jurisdictions for 56 years, it's also been divided up into intelligence jurisdictions. This is not particularly surprising that any occupation would be organized in a manner such as this. What it does mean, though, is that every Palestinian village, refugee camp, center of population in the West Bank has had a designated intelligence officer for the last 56 years. And where this situation is perhaps unique is because it's gone on for 56 years, huge amounts of intelligence has been built up on all of these Palestinian villages. Obvious things like how many Palestinians live in that village, political affiliations, who's a member of Hamas, who's a member of Fatah, who's not political at all. More relevantly to this example, who has been arrested from that village before for throwing stones? Pick them up, question them, see what they have to say for themselves. This is not unique to this situation. I'm quite sure it happens in America, it happens in Britain. A crime is committed. The police don't know who committed the crime. They round up a few of the usual suspects and question them. That happens in the West Bank. The final thing the intelligence officer does is the most important. And this is basically at the very heart of how the West Bank is controlled. The intelligence officer will look to see who are the Palestinian collaborators in the village. Difficult to get hard data on this for obvious reasons, but we've been doing this work for about 14 years. What we can say is it's quite clear the society has been thoroughly infiltrated. The way that recruitment process occurs is it can happen in the interrogation room, whether it's an adult or a child. People are put under a lot of pressure, not only to confess, but to be ongoing sources of information about what's going on inside the village. Probably the most common method of recruiting collaborators is the permit system. You've probably all heard something about the various permits Palestinians in the West Bank need to do all sorts of things, particularly the work permit system. There's a high unemployment rate in the West Bank, so if you can get a work permit to work inside Israel or inside a settlement, that's a valuable commodity. Understandably, though, if Israel's going to give a work permit to a Palestinian from the West Bank to enter Israel, they will put them through a security check. If you pass that security check, typically you'll get a work permit for 3 months, renewable every 3 months. It's not uncommon to find people who've been on these work permits for 10 or 15 years. Provided you or no one in your family violates military law, there's no reason why you can't keep that work permit. What often happens is, if you apply for one of these work permits, often no attempt will be made to recruit you the first time you apply. The idea being, assuming you pass the security check, you go off to your job in Israel or inside the settlement, and you get used to the money, you get used to the job. You start making plans for the future based on that expected income stream, hoping that you may keep this for 10 or 15 years. Then what happens is, whether it's 3, 6, 9, or 12 months later, when you go back to renew that permit, that's often when the attempt to recruit you will take place. We can renew your work permit, but this time we're going to need something in return. To give you a sense of scale, how commonplace this is purely anecdotal, but in all the villages and refugee camps we work in up and down the West Bank, the issue of collaboration always comes up. We don't raise it because it's highly sensitive, but the people in the villages always raise it because it's such a big deal. So when they do, we ask them, how many people do you think are collaborating in your village? Sorts of figures people give us range from 20% up to 60%. Now, there's no way to verify that, but the mere fact that people in these villages believe 2 out of 10 or maybe 6 out of 10 people in the village are collaborating has a profound psychological impact on that community. So if the army came to your village last night and started making arrests, the talk of the village today will be, which one of my neighbors told the intelligence officer that me or my family was involved in something? Now, the effect of that after 56 years is essentially to unravel the social fabric. And in the 14 years or so we've been doing this work, this is the best evidence we've been able to find to explain why there's little coherent resistance in the West Bank, whether it's political, peaceful, or military, because the society has been thoroughly infiltrated. It's very difficult to organize to do anything. So the intelligence officer will make contact with any collaborators in the village, put together a list of names of people to arrest. That list is then handed back to the military commander responsible for that area. He then will plan those arrests within 48 hours of that incident. About half the cases we document, the children report being arrested in the middle of the night in military raids on their houses. There are a number of practical reasons why the army will arrest people in the middle of the night. First one is very practical. Show up at 2 o'clock in the morning, the person's probably going to be home. The second one is, if you send a unit of soldiers into a Palestinian village in the middle of the day, almost certainly young people will come out and chuck rocks at them. You'll have a riot. Now, sometimes the army wants to create a situation of confrontation and have a riot. But if they don't, they will go in the middle of the night. The final reason, and it's probably the most important, and my colleague Salwa will talk more about this, is that if you send heavily armed soldiers into a civilian center of population at 2 o'clock in the morning, it has a tendency, not surprisingly, to terrify people. And this is probably the most effective measure the Israeli army has in the West Bank to suppress any form of resistance, whether it's violent or peaceful, is to send soldiers in night after night into villages that are causing them problems until the village just gives up temporarily any form of resistance. Assuming it is a night raid, most seem to occur at around 2 o'clock. It will begin with usually very aggressive banging at the front door. If you don't open up the door, it's simply blown off its hinges. Sometimes the army will use a device to open the door quietly, hydraulic jack. That enables the soldiers then to enter the house and the bedrooms whilst everyone is still asleep. So we do document cases where people wake up in their beds, in their bedroom, open their eyes, and there are 5 soldiers already in their bedroom pointing their weapons at them. Whichever method is used, everyone is usually gathered in the living room. It's a very chaotic scene. Very little information is provided, nothing about your legal rights. Sometimes the house is searched, and within about half an hour, the soldiers will leave with whoever it is they came to arrest. Interestingly, if someone wants to arrest an Israeli settler in the West Bank, you would need an arrest warrant. To arrest a Palestinian in the West Bank, the army does not need an arrest warrant. They don't give any, in most cases, they don't give any documentation at all. No explanation as to why the person's been arrested, or in many cases where they're even been taken to. So at some point, either inside the house or outside, the detainee will be zip-tied and blindfolded, put in the back of a military vehicle, and taken to one of the largest settlements in the West Bank where the interrogation centers are. We record a fair degree of abuse in the back of the military vehicles. Whether there's abuse or not will depend on the commanding officer. He's usually 26 years old. Some of them will discipline the soldiers to make sure nothing happens. In other cases, they take part in abuse. So eventually you'll be brought before an interrogator, usually about 5 or 10 hours after your arrest. You've probably been tied and blindfolded that entire period of time. Whilst you have limited rights under military law, you still have rights. So you have the right to silence, the right to consult with a lawyer. Those rights are generally disregarded. The first interrogator you meet typically will be someone in t-shirts and jeans, pistol on his side. He won't identify who he is. Typically it's Shin Bet, internal intelligence. He usually will begin by just making a very broad allegation. Why do you throw stones at Israelis? The person's going to deny they have, whether they have or they haven't. And then, based on over 1,000 testimonies we've collected, the technique follows a fairly constant pattern. It mixes threats typically with intimidation. The interrogator often will approach the detainee, whether it's a child or adult, who is usually still tied, and start yelling in their face, making threats. You're going to go to prison for a long time if you don't confess. We will arrest your mother and sister if you don't confess. We will cancel your father's work permit if you don't confess, that sort of thing. In almost every case, and it's not unique to this situation, the interrogator will also say, listen, all of your friends who we arrested with you, they've all confessed, and they all said that you were with them when they were throwing stones. And because they confessed, we sent them all home. So you're the only one in the interrogation room. The implication being all you have to do is confess, whether it's true or not. Give up some names of your friends. They gave up your name, and then you can go home. And that's often what happens. The person then, based on this, will confess. Highly unreliable. Might be true, might not be true. The interrogator then will audio record that confession of you confessing against yourself and your friends. Turns out, once you've confessed, no one has actually confessed against you. You're the first person to have confessed. The interrogator then takes that tape of you confessing to your friend in the next interrogation room, plays the tape back, and then he confesses against you. And he'll go from one interrogation room to the next, getting everybody to provide confessions against everyone else. And that's generally the evidence in these cases. Then within a couple of days, you're brought before one of 2 military courts in the West Bank. That's often where you're going to see your lawyer for the first time. Whether you're innocent or guilty, your lawyer will probably advise you to plead guilty, and that's because it's the quickest way to get out of this system. Almost every child will be denied bail. So if you want to challenge the case, you'll be denied bail, which means you're going to have to sit in prison on remand, waiting for a trial date. That can take 6 months. If you plead guilty, children currently are looking at about 4 months in prison. So it's just quicker to plead guilty. In addition to that, all the judges in these courts are Israeli military officers. Some of them live in the settlements. if you're accused of throwing stones at a settler and the judge is a settler, that's only going to end in conviction. So the conviction rate varies from between about 95% to above 99% in these courts. Then what happens is about 70% of the children, 80% of the adult prisoners are transferred out of the occupied West Bank to prisons inside Israel. That's a violation of international law. You might recall that several months ago, some Russians, including Vladimir Putin, was indicted at the International Criminal Court because they've been transferring Ukrainian children from the Crimea and occupied parts of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Within 12 months of the Russians doing that, indictments were issued against Russians. That's been going on here for 56 years. So far, no accountability. So I'll just, that's pretty much 20 minutes. I'll just say this, that once the child serves his term imprisonment, it's a generalization, but by and large, we find this to be a very effective system. Most children come out traumatized, intimidated. They never want to see another soldier again. They never want to see another settler again. Now, if you're the Israeli military commander next door, you may not like the mission you've been given by the Israeli politicians, but this is your mission, to guarantee the protection of those 500 settlers. And basically, by doing this, you've taken that generation of young Palestinians, traumatized them, intimidated them into submission. So those 500 Israeli settlers living next door in occupied territory can go about their lives pretty much as if they're living in downtown Tel Aviv. That's how it's done. Just briefly, something about administrative detention. So what I just described was a judicial process, not a very good judicial process, but it's a judicial process. Administrative detention is detention without charge or trial. So you bypass that whole court system altogether. The military commander can just issue an order detaining anyone for 6 months without charge or trial. Currently, there's 1,131 Palestinians being held without charge or trial, including 18 children. And that can be for any number of reasons. It could be, like you've probably gathered, it's not difficult to get a prosecution or conviction in the military courts. So why would you need to bother with administrative detention? It may be that the evidence you're relying on comes from an informant and you don't want to reveal that information. It could be the person hasn't committed an offense, but they have leadership capabilities. They have political organization skills. If you're going to carry on a long-term occupation with settlement construction, you have to ensure that there's no credible Palestinian leadership to challenge that. And so you might need to use administrative detention to take potential leaders out of the debate. So that's some reasons why you might use administrative detention. I'll stop there because we want to leave time for questions. I'll hand over to Salwa, who will talk a little bit about the impact of all of this, and then hopefully we will have plenty of time for questions.
The system that Gerard described is well thought out, and it's designed for a particular purpose, and that is to maintain control over the entire Palestinian population. It's not simply targeting children. Of course, it does affect children, but it's part of a broader system that aims to maintain the situation as it is, so that there's no uprising, and that there's no leadership, and that there's no political process of any meaningful outcome. So this system that Gerard described, as you can imagine, has a profound negative human impact on the Palestinians subjected to it. And it doesn't only affect children, it affects the entire, the family and the community at large. And this is what I will shed light on based on more than 1,000 testimonies collected over the last 10 years or so. I would like to start that the effectiveness of the system starts from moment zero. It's the shock of the night arrest, the shock of banging aggressively at the front door in the middle of the night with parents, children, sometimes grandparents fast asleep. It is estimated that on average, the Israelis will conduct about 8 night raids each night. So since 1967, on average, eight night raids a night, affecting 8 families every day, every night. So if you multiply by 56 years of occupation, and if you keep in mind what our evidence shows is that most of these operations are focused on towns and villages and refugee camps next door to settlements. So it's small, relatively small number of households that are taking the brunt of this huge number of night raids. So it's not a surprise when families tell me that they believe each and every single house in their town, village, or refugee camp has been raided, if not once, multiple times. One mother couldn't even remember the number of times her own house was raided. So she was surprised by my question, and she said, I lost count, it's dozens of times. You know, I can go and give examples. There's a village near Ramallah. So that village, we monitored it during 1 month, and it was raided 16 times in just 1 month, meaning every other night the military were in that village making their presence felt, disturbing the normal life of that village. One mother told me in a refugee camp, when I asked her, how often are the army in your camp? She said, they're here 8 out of 7 days a week, meaning they don't ever leave. And they make their presence day and night. So they react to something, to an incident, of course they do, but they also go into the Palestinian communities proactively, so that they try to intimidate and frighten, so that no one dares do anything. And the impact is devastating. Mothers tell me how they don't sleep at night. They wake up exhausted, unable to focus. Fathers tell me how they're humiliated in front of their family, in front of their teenage boys, and it affects them psychologically, and they probably react or try to restore the situation by becoming more angry, by becoming more aggressive, by trying to impose their authority again, and respect by, not very wise means. It affects the situation, the dynamics in the family. Mothers and fathers argue all the time. They don't know how to handle a troubled boy. I must say the impact on the boys is devastating. So once the child is released after spending 4 months in prison, the family will throw a party celebrating the homecoming. But the parents tell me almost as soon as the party is over, they realize that the nightmare has just begun. The mothers tell me how the boy's behavior is changed. He becomes more aggressive, disrespectful of his parents. He lost trust that they can protect him. He spends time on his own, isolating himself, doesn't take part in the family activities. Many boys drop out of school because they cannot keep up. 4 months in prison is a long time with hardly any education in prison. I must say that leaving school has, of course, as you can imagine, long-term impact on the child. A school without at least high school education is a lifetime of failure, lack of opportunities, poverty, and on it goes. The most important reason why boys don't want to go back to school is because they are deeply mistrustful of the children around them. They know one of the boys reported them to the authorities, and that is why they ended up in prison. Even worse, they know that no one around them trusts them because they spent time in prison. They were questioned and interrogated. They probably gave names of boys or will continue to give names or information. So the first advice that parents tell their children when another boy is released is stay away from that child. We don't want you to be seen around him. And you can imagine the mental state that these children are in at this very fragile stage in their lives, that they're deeply mistrustful. They know that no one trusts them. The interrogations are quite harsh. And part of the interrogation method is the threats of putting a child in administrative detention. So Gerard described how this is not a judicial process. You can be locked in prison for months and months, renewable, without even being told what you're accused of, and without appearing in front of a judge. So that has a profound impact on the children. Just simply the threats of an administrative detention make children want to confess to anything just to please the interrogator, so that they are not placed in administrative detention. One child told me that he was actually put under administrative detention, and he was handed a 3-month order, and he spent it. And just as he was leaving prison, on the day he was supposed to leave, because he finished the 3 months, he was handed an additional 3 months. And it was done for a whole year. So 4 times he was handed a whole year. This child, I can't remember his name, but he would have been older, like 17 most probably. He spent a whole year in prison, not knowing what he's accused of, not having the opportunity to defend himself. A lawyer is completely useless, because when you're not told what you're accused of, no lawyer can do anything. And it had a terrible impact on that boy. I must say also that part of the interrogation, apart from the threat of administrative detention, recently there has been a surge in number of children placed in solitary confinement. So that is also a method. Interrogators threaten the children with solitary confinement, and they actually impose it on them. They lock them in very small rooms without any windows, so the children don't know whether it's day or night. They cannot tell how many days they already spent there. Light will be left on 24 hours, which makes it very hard to sleep. There will be an open sewer, which is used as a toilet, and children tell me the stench is horrible. Insects are crawling, like cockroaches and other things. The only the children don't have any meaningful contact with any human being apart from the interrogator. So one child told me he wanted to keep chatting to the interrogator just to keep the conversation going, because he wanted to speak to somebody. He didn't want to go back to sit alone in a small room. Children tell me how they attempt suicide. They lose hope completely. They don't want to live anymore. One child told me how he cut his wrist with a plastic fork which came with his food. He wanted to cut himself. Another boy banged his head against the rough surface of the wall to attract the attention. The other day, a boy told me he went on strike for 9 days, a hunger strike for 9 days, because he wanted to kill himself. And then when he didn't die, he drank shampoo, which was in his room for him to use. He was so desperate. He said, I wanted either to die or to get out of that situation. And a child that goes through this kind of treatment is probably a traumatized child for a very, very long time. This situation affects the entire family. The thing that starts with a night raid. Like children, younger siblings are terrified to see soldiers masked in the middle of their bedroom, pushing their older brother in a corner, humiliating their father. They become clingy to their parents. They don't want to sleep in their own bedrooms. Their schoolwork is affected. They become frightened to any sound that they hear. They shout and scream and cry whenever there's a sound around the house. And this is basically what it takes for the Israeli army to keep control of millions of Palestinians, while at the same time moving hundreds of thousands of settlers into occupied territory in violation of international law. This is how this is the only way that it can be done. And the message basically is to the Palestinians, you either submit whatever political situation we impose on you, or you leave, or you live in terror, day in and day out, night in and night out. There's no fourth option, unfortunately. And as you can imagine, this is the main, this is fertile soil for breeding anger and frustration and hopelessness. And that is why we keep seeing cycles of unrest in the West Bank. People cannot take it anymore. And then the measures are escalated, and then people get quiet, and on it goes. It's cycles and cycles of never-ending unrest, destroying lives and destroying futures of young children. This is the situation. Maybe we have time. I think, yeah, we hopefully have time for questions.
Yeah, we
comments.
do. There's two things I'd like to say, and then I'd love to open up the floor for questions. First of all, thank you to both of you for giving us that absolutely heartbreaking, but very thorough and clear overview of what this system looks like and just how damaging it is at so many levels. And the two things I wanted to tease out were, oftentimes when I'm talking with family and friends, I think it's really important to understand that regardless of the behavior of settlers and settlements themselves are inherently violent because of this system that you've described. So there's no way for settlements to be quote unquote peacefully in the West Bank when this is the kind of invisible structural and direct violence that comes out of protecting those. And then the other piece I wanted to tease out for those of you who are familiar with Telos's kind of tagline of, right, we're working for mutual flourishing, which we describe as freedom, dignity, security, and human rights for Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure. I think everything Salwa and Gerard just described so perfectly encapsulates why the current system of trying to protect security for Israelis so actively undercuts the freedom, dignity, security, and human rights of Palestinians. And so, right, as we're working for mutual flourishing, as we're working for all of those goals for both peoples, for everyone in that land, security for one can't come at the costs for everybody else, and vice versa. And so those are the two pieces I wanted to tease out that really stood out to me in the context of some of the other conversations we've been having in the Learning Corps, and some talking points potentially as you're thinking about how to bring this back to your community, that those are really important points to be able to make as we talk about how all of this fits together. But I'll stop there because I want you all to have as much time as possible to ask questions of these two. And if you don't have any, I have so many, but I want to open up the floor to you all. So we're a small enough group. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask directly. And if people need a little longer to think, feel free to jump in and cut me off because I do want your questions to come first. But I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about the court monitoring program you run and what the goal of bringing folks in to witness this firsthand is. How does that fit into the model of transformation that you all are doing in addition to kind of trying to hold the system accountable to itself?
Yeah, I mean, one example is over the years, we've taken something like 15% of the UK Parliament to the military courts. And so that has raised the profile of the issue at a political level, at least in the UK. Been a number of debates in the Parliament on that issue. Because what we find, I mean, you've experienced it yourself. You can talk about it, but there's something, it's really hard to put into words when you take people to the military courts, because it's just so chaotic. You'll recall when you went with Salwa, you know, that these courts are in prefab little shacks, basically. Very, very chaotic. People coming and going and noise and nothing like a courtroom you would expect. And there's so many aspects of the system that are disturbing, such as when I think of military courts, I think of people shooting people and blowing stuff up. And you do have some of those cases, but like 25% of the cases in the military courts in the West Bank are traffic offenses. So it's Palestinians in Area C not wearing seatbelts or speeding can be pulled over by an Israeli policeman, and the case ends up in the military courts. You don't have to show up, you have to send a lawyer. And they're currently raising about 25,000 US dollars a week on traffic offenses, revenue raising. Now, I'm quite sure, like, when the US was in Iraq and they placed Iraq under military law, they established military courts as they were entitled to. And they prosecuted tens of thousands of Iraqis in the military courts. I'm quite sure they weren't prosecuting them for speeding tickets or parking offenses, though. You know, it's a complete abuse of the system. And like I said, it's basically revenue raising. The courts are raising over 6 million US dollars a year. That's an old figure from 2017. That money from the fines goes into Israel's central bank. It doesn't go to the Palestinians. So it's used, you know, just to basically fund the occupation. And you know, I could go on. It's an abuse of this. This, you know, it's a military law and military courts for civilians is a very temporary structure. It's used to just bridge, you know, the chaos that ensues full-on war. You know, it's not meant to be perpetual. And I think it's worth noting too, like, there's nothing in the Fourth Geneva Convention. I mentioned it's supposed to be temporary. There's nothing in international law which defines temporary, which in many ways is not surprising. You don't want to be too prescriptive. Every occupation will be different. But if I were presenting this in a courtroom, what I would do is say, well, let's get a sense of what is normal by looking at other occupations. So the Allied occupation of Germany in 1945, the US occupation of Japan in 1945, and more recently, the occupation of Iraq, they all lasted less than 10 years, which I think means, doesn't mean an occupation is automatically illegal after 10 years, but you have to start asking some hard questions after 10 years. And if after 10 years you find that the occupying power has been moving its own civilians into occupied territory, then I think any court would not have any trouble at all in finding that it's illegal. And after 56 years, I think that's certainly the case.
I'd like to add a few points. Going to court has multiple purposes and benefits, I would say. So first of all, we speak to the families who are waiting in the waiting room, and they get to tell their stories. You know, mothers tell us how, you know, 2 nights ago their house was raided, and the pain is still fresh. And it has a huge impact on people who listen to them. And it's also beneficial to the mothers and to the women who are there, because most Palestinians feel they have been abandoned and that they're on their own and nobody cares. So when they get an opportunity to speak to visiting delegations, some of whom are diplomats, lawyers, judges, students from all over the world, Americans, Europeans, Australians, it brings back a little bit of hope that, you know, some people care, that their voices are not simply unheard, that people do care and want to find, you know, and understand the situation they're living in. Also, going into the courtroom is also important. We are told by some lawyers that every time we take a delegation into the court, they believe that the judge's behavior is different. You know, it can be very subtle, but they tell, you know, the other day a lawyer came to me and he said, "Thank God you're here today. I have a very important case. Last time you were here, the judge gave a ruling that was totally unexpected. Nobody could believe it. It's because you were there." So that's another aspect. It's little drops in the ocean, but that's all we can do, unfortunately. But, you know, hopefully they will add, and, you know, one day there will be an impact.
Any other questions?
Have any of you visited?
Looks like Jennifer has.
Mhm.
Or Jennifer, if you've got a question, feel free to jump in and ask it directly.
No question. I was just there in June, and yeah, I definitely just always want to be expanding my knowledge so that I can continue to do whatever I can from here to, advocate for the pro peacemaking and mutual flourishing. And administrative detention it's just terrible and heartbreaking, as you've said. So thank you. I'm sorry I was late to join the meeting, and I don't have any questions, but thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for sharing. I was going to ask, Salwa, you talked about hope, and one of the things that one of our other partners, Mitri Rahab, always says is hope is what you do. And so in that sense, I'd love for us to end with a little bit of a call for action. And I can talk about the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, the bill that Representative Betty McCollum has introduced. But before I do that, I wanted to ask both of you, what is the way that you think folks like us who are not in Israel, Palestine, are not Israeli citizens, how can we be most effective in advocating to help hold our governments accountable, or the way we play a role accountable in preventing programs from like this from continuing, advocating for human rights for Palestinians in general, but especially for children? What's the role that we can play from where we are in supporting you guys in the work you do?
One thing someone mentioned to me once was that something like 200 members of your Congress come here every year, mainly brought by AIPAC. I would be surprised if a single one of them has ever been to the military courts. And that strikes me as highly problematic, that at least in theory, as I understand it, US foreign policy is still for a two-state solution. It seems extraordinary that 200 members of Congress could come here every year and not get the full picture, basically hear mainly from one side what's going on rather than the other. And I think in any democracy, that's just highly disturbing. Whatever your political views are, you want your elected officials to get all the information so that then they can make informed decisions. There was an interesting proposal for one of the major parties in Australia. And what they said, the Labour Party, what they said was that because Australia's official position is, like America, a two-state solution, if you are invited to Israel or Palestine as a member of parliament, you have to spend 50% of your time with each side. You can't just go and, you can't just talk to Palestinians, or you can't just talk to Israelis, because that's inconsistent with our stated policy of a two-state solution. So that might be something to think about, that when you hear that some of your members of Congress are traveling here, encourage them to spend a morning at the military courts. We took the head of the European Union, the official in charge of human rights, to the military courts a couple of months ago. He just had one day in the whole of the West Bank to deal with every single issue, one day. So we were able to just spend 30 minutes in the military courts. That's the only time he had, but it has a profound impact. So I think applying pressure to members of Congress, insisting that they must spend some time seeing the other side of the story in order to get informed policy out of it.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. The bill I was going to talk about a little bit, and we've talked about this before, but if you're newer to Telos or this type of programming, it might be the first time you've heard about it. Congresswoman Betty McCollum introduced a bill called Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation, HR 3103. And I'll send out some more information about this along with the recording for today. But the idea behind it is to prohibit Israel from using US taxpayer dollars on the military detention, abuse, or ill treatment of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention. There's a couple other things like that, some things about home demolitions and some other pieces about annexation. But I think this is, like Gerard was saying, a really great kind of pressure point for anyone who at least pays lip service to a two-state solution or talk about human rights and kind of care, in part because it approaches it from that point of you're using my taxpayer money to do an action that I'm completely against, that's not aligned with my values. And hopefully, in theory, right, folks should agree that this is no way to treat a child, that the human rights of children need to be respected. And so even if it feels like this might be pushing uphill or upstream, whatever the metaphor is, I think the more attention we can keep on this, especially towards our elected representatives, the more likelihood we have of actually getting folks to pay attention or to think about this or think about it from a slightly different angle than they historically have. Because hopefully they are listening to us. I currently live in DC, so I don't have a representative in Congress who can vote. But I think the more we can push on this, the more we can hold other folks to account to align actions with values as well. And so, like I said, I'll send out some more information about that. But I hope that coming out of this conversation today, we've learned a lot. It's really heavy because the subject material is really heavy, but there are things we can do to try and push to work for that mutual flourishing that I described. Salwa and Gerard, any final thoughts? Please go ahead.
There's a bigger picture aspect too, and that many of the legal aspects of what's going on in Ukraine and Crimea currently are the same legal principles that apply here. So annexation of territory. Russia has purported to annex Crimea. Within a couple of weeks, they've been sanctioned. Israel, has annexed East Jerusalem 56 years ago, nothing. I mentioned the transfer of prisoners out of occupied territory. That's been happening here for 56 years. Nothing happened. About 30,000 children have been transferred in that 56 years period. Within 1 year of Russia transferring children, there was an indictment at the International Criminal Court. Now, why the different treatment? It's not a mystery. Russia is a strategic adversary. Israel is a strategic partner. But if we seriously adhere to a rules-based order, that's probably the quickest way I can think of destroying the credibility and people's faith in the institutions and the rules. It's so obvious that you're applying the rules to one party and not the other party simply based on your interests rather than the rule of law. So I think there are some real dangers there of just eroding confidence in anything relating to rules and institutions.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've pushed on with my family and friends again, too, that idea of that when human rights are eroded or threatened anywhere, they're threatened everywhere. So even if folks don't pay attention to Israel-Palestine on a daily basis, or this isn't an area they're experts in, or there's other areas in the world that they choose to focus on, all of us are called to protect human rights, not just for children, but I think personally, especially for children when they're threatened anywhere, because that is a threat, as you were saying, to those rights and the foundational principles they're built on for all of us, right? It has a potential personal impact in a way that this work is not just rooted in love for someone else, but is also protecting our own rights, freedoms, and belief systems.
And I mean, there's a particular example with the Golan Heights. So the Trump administration recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and the Biden administration has adopted that. Now that undermines the same legal principle that prevents Russia annexing Crimea. Yeah. What's our argument? What's our complaint against Russia then? It's potentially unraveling all of those rules we put in place at the end of the Second World War in order to prevent this sort of stuff happening in the future. And if we're just picking and choosing who we apply the rules to, we cannot be surprised if no one has any confidence in these rules and they end up collapsing. So there's sort of that sort of national security aspect to it all as well.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts from either of you? I want to be mindful of your time and the fact we've hit 1 o'clock. So any final closing comments, thoughts, calls to actions you'd like to leave us with today?
I think leaving people without any legitimate legal remedies, like, no political process, no legal avenue, pushes people downwards into hopelessness, and they will say, okay, we're on our own. All these systems and laws that are made to protect situations exactly like ours are not applied to us. So we're on our own, and unfortunately, that's a very unhealthy situation to be in, and
Yeah.
it can lead to devastating consequences to everyone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for the time you've spent with us today, telling us more about these, educating us, hopefully helping us understand why it's so important that we speak out against these policies and advocate where we have access. Super heavy topic. So for those of you still on the call, as I mentioned, we're going to end the official recording, say goodbye to Salwa and Gerard, but then we can stay on if we want to process some of this a little more emotionally or personally, or just to keep talking or thinking it through a little bit less formally. But thank you so much, Salwa and Gerard, for joining us today. Really appreciate you both and the very, very important work you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.